Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So first thing here, you can probably see, yeah, I've got some new digs here. I've slowly been working on a new studio for the past several months. Now, I'm not quite ready to reveal everything just yet, but I do plan on making like a studio tour video here in the next couple weeks once I have everything just nice and perfect. And the second thing is, yeah, you've probably noticed I have a beard now. I've been retired now from the military for about a month and a half, so I've been growing this out and just kind of getting a feel for how it is on the outside. And so yeah, now that I'm basically a full-time YouTuber, I have a lot of projects in the works and I'm excited to show them off in the future. But before we get into any of that stuff, let's do a review. Now this is the AYN Odin Lite. Now I've had this for a few days now, I've been testing it pretty thoroughly, and that's what we're going to focus on here in this review. Now there's a long story with this device. I first pre-ordered it back in August of 2021, so it's been over a year since the day I put down the money to when I actually have it in my hands. And that does say something in this kind of technology-focused world. Things will change very quickly over the course of 1 year. And so that's kind of what I'm going to focus on here, is whether or not it's going to be worth it when you place your order versus when you're actually going to have it fulfilled. Now, I don't expect it to take an entire year. Like for me, I think that about 4, maybe 5 months altogether would be your worst case scenario at this point. But still, that's kind of a long time to wait. For example, you could be playing games for a good 4 months if you bought a different device that's available today. And in addition, there's another model of the Odin called the Odin Pro, which I'll do some comparisons with that as well, because that one is also shipping right now. And finally, AYN, the company that's made the Odin, has also been working on a new device called the Loki. And those prices are pretty similar, and so I think we need to take that into consideration as well. Anyway, I'm hoping this is not going to be a super deep dive video. I don't want something that's an hour long, but you know how I am, I'm kind of long-winded. So we'll just do an exhaustive review, and it's going to be as long as it needs. So without any further delay, let's jump into it. Okay, let's get started with some of the specs. Now the Odin Lite uses a Dimensity D900 chip. This is a relatively new mobile CPU with 8 cores altogether. By default, the Odin Lite comes with 4 gigs of RAM and 64 gigs of storage, but for about $30 you can actually double that amount. And like with the Odin Pro, this has a 6-inch 1080p touchscreen. Now if you've been following along in the news in the whole handheld world, they actually ran out of screens a couple months ago. And so now all future Odin Lites and Odin Pros are going to come with a new screen. And the model that I'm testing here has that new version 2 screen. And we'll do some tests of this compared to the version 1 here later in the video. The device also comes with a hefty 6600 mAh battery, and one of the things that sets it apart from the Odin Pro is the connectivity. This comes with Wi-Fi 6, and in addition to Bluetooth 5.2, this can also use LTE connectivity. Again, that's something we'll test in this video. This comes with a micro HDMI port as well as a headphone jack, and because it's a newer chip, it actually ships with Android 11. Okay, now let's talk about price and availability. Now if you go to the AYN website, you can see there's an Odin selection as well as the Odin Lite. Within the Odin one, it has the base and the Pro models. And then the Odin Super Pack just comes with the Super Dock and I think a couple other accessories. Now if you go onto the Odin Lite part of the page, you can see that it's not actually available for sale right here. But as you can see, the planned listed price is $200. So you cannot buy this from their website like you can their other devices. In fact, the only place you can buy it right now is on their old Indiegogo page from last year. And so for the Odin Lite, they're still taking orders right here, but it is a little bit more expensive. As you can see here, $227. And as you can see, the estimated shipping time is next month. But I wouldn't take that too seriously considering that all of their shipments have been delayed. Now if you go in and select get this perk, you can see that it does have 3 different color models, and the one that I ordered is the white/panda model here. And just to kind of round out the whole cost here, it is going to cost shipping as well. You can see here it's about $28 standard to the US. And additionally, if you wanted to upgrade your RAM and storage, that's going to cost another $30 as well. So if you wanted to get the model that I have here, it's spec'd out at about $280 altogether after shipping. Now if you are interested in the Odin Base or the Pro models, those are actually for sale, available on the AYN website. The base model starts at $240 and it goes up from there. Now on the website here, it says that shipments are supposed to have started earlier this month, but I don't actually think that's been happening yet. Like I said, all of these shipments have been delayed significantly. It's kind of chaos right now. And so if you order one, yes, you probably will get it eventually, but I'm not sure when. Now for the fully spec'd Odin Pro, it's going to cost you $328 altogether. So after shipping, the whole spectrum here is going to be between about $250 and $350 depending on the the model you buy. And again, it's not very clear when these are actually going to ship. On their website, they do have a page that's called a shipping dashboard, and on here you can see what they're planning on shipping each day. But you might be surprised at how few they actually manufacture and ship every day. It's usually around 50 altogether. And so that can be a little bit disheartening, and I think part of the problem is they have just so many different models and available options that it's very hard and time consuming to actually build these to spec. Now, if you thought that was complicated, we haven't even gotten started yet. There's an entirely new model from AYN called the Loki. And these are different. These are not Android devices. They are handheld PCs that'll run both Linux and Windows. And they're supposed to start shipping as of fourth quarter of this year. But if the fulfillment of the Odin orders is any indication, I'm not holding my breath for that at all. The prices on these will start around $200. The Loki Zero, for example, is a competitor with the Ambinic Win 600. And this one does have some upgrades over the Win 600, like the ability to use dual channel RAM if you pay for that additional chip. And there's a bunch of other Loki models that are available. I encourage you to kind of flip through the website and see if any interest you. But I would also caution you to say that there are no prototypes for any of these devices even available right now. So if you do put down your money for one of these devices, you may be in a situation where it may be another year before you actually see them, like it was for me with the Odin Lite. Either way, at the end of the day, this entire setup is kind of a mess. There's so many different models available, it's super confusing, and the shipment timeline is not very clear at all. Either way, eventually the Odin Lite did arrive on my door, so let's do a quick unboxing and actually take a look. Now, like I mentioned, I ordered the white or the panda model, and I gotta say, I'm super impressed and very happy with that choice. If you're interested in things like the size and the weight and some of those other aspects, then I would recommend checking out my Odin Pro review because this device is exactly the same. So I'm really just going to highlight some of the differences. For example, the RGB lighting here along the sides has that black strip here. That is really cool because I didn't have that with my other one. The D-pad is exactly the same. This is like a PS Vita, so it's very clicky but also soft. It's really nice and precise, one of my favorite D-pads on a retro handheld. Now, the analog sticks, by contrast, are some of my least favorite. These are small and short. In fact, they're significantly smaller and shorter than on the Nintendo Switch, which are already kind of dinky. Now, that being said, I've made a video about how to improve the stick experience on the Odin models, and so you can check that out here on this channel. Additionally, the face buttons don't look like they've changed either. These are also one of the very few things I don't like about the Odin models. Personally, I feel like the buttons have too much travel, like you're pushing down on them too far in order to actually click. On top of that, the rubber connection is just a little bit too stiff. It requires a lot of force to push down a button. Personally, I wish they had less travel or they glided more smoothly. Any combination of those I think would be much better. And I'm hoping they do make a change to this with the upcoming Loki models as well. It also appears there have been no changes to the shoulder and trigger buttons from the Odin Pro. These are analog sensing triggers, one of my favorite things about the device, and the shoulder buttons are nice and solid as well. Overall, this is just a super solid device. Like, it feels really strong and hefty in the hands, and every component feels really well thought out. I obviously have some minor complaints about the feel of the analog sticks and the face buttons, but overall it is a great product. One other minor complaint I have is about the placement of the function buttons. Up here on the top right is the home button, and I find myself pressing that very often when I'm actually trying to press the start button instead. I would have preferred that they had put function buttons on the bottom left, like a back and a home button here. That would have given them the space to put the select and start buttons up here on the top like they are on the Nintendo Switch Lite. I just think overall that layout would have been more intuitive. So let's take a quick look at the top as we power on the device. We have the power button and then a volume rocker and then also the exhaust vent for the active cooling fan. Now, in case you're not already familiar with the whole Odin setup, now this is an Android-based device. And like I mentioned, this ships with Android 11. That being said, it is a custom Android build, so you will see things like the Odin logo as you boot it up, and it'll have an initial configuration specific to the Odin as well. On top of that, there are some Odin settings, so you can go in and change some of the functions and things like that. I'm not going to get into the weeds about that because I've created a whole starter guide that'll walk you through that whole process. Either way, once you start it all up, it's going to basically be a bare bones Android tablet. And so it's kind of neat to be able to start from scratch like that, but it is going to require some setup. Now, first thing, once I have it booted up here, I do want to check out those RGB lights. They should be around the sticks as well as the sides of the device. And yeah, look at that. They look incredible. I previously had the black model of the Odin Pro, and while I enjoyed the LED lights on that, these look a lot better on the white shell like this. In fact, this is by far the best looking Odin I've ever held. Now, you may have noticed on the top there's a little flag flap here. Let's open that up and take a look inside. On the left, we have a micro HDMI output, so we can plug this into a TV. And then you'll also see a very familiar looking SIM card slot right here. Now on the Odin Pro, it was just an SD card slot. So let's open this up and take a look. As you can see, I've already put an SD card inside, so it does allow you to have external storage, but it also has a place for a SIM card. So let's test that out as well. So I went and stole the SIM card from my wife's phone. I can't use my own phone because that's what I use for my camera right here, but let's go ahead and close this up and test it out. And so yeah, as you can see here, I have the Wi-Fi turned off, but it's still getting a 4G data signal. And it's connected to my T-Mobile network seamlessly. So let's do a quick test of my cellular speeds. Now remember, I live in Hawaii, so speeds here are not great. But as you can see here, I got 5 megabits download and then 0.79 megabits upload. Not the best, but hey, it's pretty cool and it's going to work really great for retro achievements or something like that. So let's go the whole Monty. Let's see if we can make a phone call. I'm going to call the Naval Observatory to see what the time is.
U.S. Naval Observatory Master Clock at the tone, Eastern Daylight Time. 16 hours, 23 minutes.
Okay, so phone calls work. Let's make sure the mic works. That's a little dot on the top left of the device. Testing 1 2 1 2. Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core.
Testing 1 2 1 2. Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core.
And so yeah, the mic works as well, so you could definitely use this to answer phone calls if you wanted. Finally, I'm going to send myself a text here, and yeah, it actually did go through to my phone. I obviously can't answer back because I'm using it as my camera, but instead I sent an email to my wife as a text message, and sure enough, it showed up right here. And so yes, unlike the Odin Pro, the Odin Lite is capable of doing both text and voice. It's up to you whether or not you want to actually get a SIM card for it, but it's possible. Now, the Odin Lite has Wi-Fi 6. The Odin Pro only has 5 GHz Wi-Fi. But as you can see here, the speeds are basically the same between the two when connected to the same Wi-Fi network. Of course, there's lots of variables when it comes to network connections. It's not all about the speed, but also the strength of the connection. And theoretically, a Wi-Fi 6 antenna is going to give you a more stable connection. And so theoretically, the Odin Lite should do better when it comes to Wi-Fi streaming. Okay, now let's talk about the new screen. Now, the old screen was actually a 61 Hz display, and that would cause some micro stuttering with retro games. But here with the new screens, I'm happy to say this is a 59.77 Hz screen. That means it's going to work great for retro games, no more of that micro stuttering. Now, compared to the version 1 screen, you can see just how bad that VSync is across the board. Now on this website, it used to say 61 Hz pretty stably. I think the reason why it's all over the map like this is because AYN probably implemented a software update to try to bring it down to 60, but it doesn't seem to be a very stable sync. Either way, if you're getting one of these Odin models shipping in the next week and beyond, you really don't have to worry about this because the version 2 screens are going to have that nice stable connection. Now let's do a quick quality test between the two screens. We're going to have the Odin Pro on top and the Odin Lite on the bottom. Now I've turned off my studio lights here, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to turn the brightness all the way down to the most dim. The idea here is the Odin Pro is super good at playing in a very dark environment, and I want to make sure the Odin Lite is going to be good as well. And as you can see here, the new screen is significantly brighter than the old screen at its lowest dimness. Now that being said, I did play this at night a few times, and honestly, even in a pitch black environment, this still isn't very bright to me. And so what I would say is the Odin Lite screen is excellent in a low light environment, but the Odin Pro version 1 screen was even better. Of course, there are a couple tricks you can do to make it a little bit softer on the eyes. You can turn on the night light here in the upper settings, and that will make it easier to look out in a really dark environment. Okay, so now let's bring it up to a 50% brightness on both screens. And honestly, at 50% brightness, it's kind of a wash. I feel like the version 1 screen is a little bit brighter at 50%, but honestly, I think that they both look nice and balanced at this intensity. So now let's try maxing it out all the way to full brightness. And as you can see, the version 1 screen is quite a bit more bright. You can tell by how washed out it is in the brighter areas. So what that means to me is that the version 1 screen is going to be better both in a very dark and a very bright environment. But that being said, I have no real complaints about the Odin Lite's dimness or brightness. I think it's also excellent and one of the best in the business. Now the other thing I want to compare between the Odin Lite and Pro is performance and battery life. We'll start with performance first, and I was surprised to find that it's kind of a wash between the two. Obviously, with a name like Odin Lite, you're going to think it's a less powerful version than the Pro one. But honestly, when it comes to emulation performance, it's almost neck and neck. In fact, in some scenarios, it's actually better on the Lite than the Pro. So right now, I'm going to play the same scene here in Final Fantasy XII, and I'm just going to let it play out as we talk. When it comes down to it, I think the comparison of the two is not whether or not one is better than the other. They're just a little bit different by nature of being either a Qualcomm or a MediaTek chip. To me, I kind of liken it to Intel versus AMD. Each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses, but at the end of the day, either of these companies have their fans for different reasons. I'd say the major advantage between the Pro and the Lite is that the Pro is able to dual boot into either Linux or Windows. And so if you're looking for a more well-rounded chip altogether, then the Snapdragon one that is found in the Odin Pro is going to be your better bet. But in terms of performance here, with the PS2 in particular, you can see that the Odin Lite is actually performing much better than the Odin Pro. The Pro is having quite a lot of slowdowns, as you can see with the red text on the top right, whereas the Odin Lite keeps on trucking and actually gets ahead of the Odin Pro. In fact, after a 2-minute and 45-second cutscene, you can see that the Odin Lite is actually 16 seconds ahead of the Odin Pro with this particular game. Of course, that's going to vary by game and emulator and everything else, but it is something that I thought was significant. At the end of the day, if you're looking for a device that will do very good emulation, there's no compromise between the two. These are both excellent. However, there is one other compromise we need to talk about. And the compromise here is the battery life. What I found is that the Odin Pro has significantly better battery life than the Odin Lite between my two models. Now, this is kind of confusing to me because the Odin Lite has a more efficient chip and they both have the same size battery. And so theoretically, the Odin Lite should perform better. But as you can see here, after 3 hours of gameplay with Final Fantasy XII at a 2x resolution and 50% brightness, the Odin Pro went from 100% battery down to 63%, whereas the Odin Lite kind of tanked. It went from 100% to 33% in 3 hours. Now, I'm not super well versed when it comes to power performance, but my suspicion here is it has to do with the screen between the version 1 and version 2. We've already seen indications that the version 2 screen is going to be more power hungry. Now, let me caveat all that by saying that this is after 3 hours of gameplay. 3 hours of PS2 gameplay on a device is pretty awesome. At the end of the day, I would expect between 4 and 5 hours of PS2 gameplay on the Odin Lite, whereas you might get something like 8 or 9 hours from the Odin Pro. And honestly, I think that's really great battery performance regardless of the device you're using, especially when you try to compare it against something like the Steam Deck or a Windows-based handheld. So long story short, battery life is great on both, but it's better on the Pro model that I own, and I'm not sure if that has to do with the Pro model itself or its screen. Now, another battery test I did was streaming performance. I thought this was kind of important because this is such a great streaming device. And so what I did is I left it with Game Pass cloud streaming with Forza Horizon 5. And what I found is that the battery diminished about 15% every hour. And so what that means is you can expect between 6 and 7 hours of game streaming on the Odin Lite. Now, one other function I wanted to touch on is the HDMI video out. My setup here is I'm using a micro HDMI adapter to HDMI here in this monitor, and it connected just fine 1080p, no problems whatsoever. Now, the Odin Pro can not only use micro HDMI on the top, but it can also use video out through USB-C on the bottom. Unfortunately, the chip used in the Odin Lite is not capable of this feature. But that being said, I have no complaints about the video out capability of this device. And this device is compatible with the Super Dock that AYN sells. You won't be able to use the USB-C function for video out, you'll have to use a little adapter for micro HDMI. Either way, video out works just fine. Now, like I mentioned previously, I created a whole starter guide for the AYN Odin, and it'll apply to both the Pro and the Lite models. And so I'm not going to bore you with the entire setup that I did to get everything up and running, I'm just going to show you the finished product. And I'll leave a link to the starter guide in the video description. And so here we are with the launch box front end, and everything's all set up and looks great. This took me a few hours altogether, but I've done it several times at this point. You basically just have to install all your emulators and then point the Launchbox app to everything. Anyway, once you have it set up, it can be a pretty seamless experience. For the lower end systems, it'll just boot right into RetroArch and you can set your cores and everything else. And you can set up all your hotkeys to have things like fast forward and rewind and run ahead and all the other things that are important when it comes to emulation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time with these retro systems because I think you're probably going to know what to expect. All of these play just fine. Because it is a widescreen device, I do recommend trying out widescreen hacks when available, for example with Sega Genesis. Because honestly, even if the widescreen hacks are a little bit glitchy on the sides, I still think it's a little bit better than those black bars. Of course, that's all going to be personal preference. Game Boy Advance is one of those systems that looks the best because it is a 3:2 aspect ratio, and one of my favorite things here is that the fast forward works wonderfully on here. As you can see, it runs at about 1500 frames per second. And so if you want to breeze through a Pokemon game, this is going to work really well, especially on Game Boy Advance. And just to verify here, yes, Nintendo DS and 3DS use the touchscreen and it works really well. All my inputs were super precise. I felt like a really top surgeon while playing this game. Anyway, yes, if you want to use this for Nintendo DS, it's a really great machine. We'll talk about 3DS more here in a second. But let's kind of go up the charts here with the lower end systems and moving our way up. We'll start with Sega Saturn first. Now, a lot of people like using the standalone Yabasan emulator. In fact, that's the one that I recommend in my Odin starter guide. But I found with this chip in particular, it didn't actually run very well. There were a lot of graphical glitches and things like that. And so instead, I went the other route. I went with RetroArch and then I used the Beetle core. This one in particular is known for being a very accurate core, but it does not upscale beyond the native resolution. But honestly, I prefer the native resolution when it comes to Sega Saturn anyway, and so I really had a good time with this. On top of that, it allowed me to use functions like fast forward hotkeys and save states and things like that. And so overall, I actually really enjoyed this experience, and I think I'm going to use Beetle more often when I have a powerful system like this. Not every game's going to play perfectly. You will see some slowdowns down to like say 56 frames per second, but overall I had a really great time with Sega Saturn using this core. For Nintendo 64, you can use either the standalone Mupen 64 FC Plus emulator, or you could use the Mupen 64 core within RetroArch. Again, for this testing, I decided to use the Mupen 64 core in RetroArch. One, because it works really well. As you can see here with fast forward on, I'm getting 250 frames per second. But again, I really appreciate having the ability to use those hotkeys in RetroArch right here on the system. Regardless, Nintendo 64 is going to play great, and I should mention this is upscaled to 1080p as well. So yes, Nintendo 64, no problem on this device. Let's keep going over to Sega Dreamcast. Now this one I actually upscaled to 1440p and then also turned on the widescreen hack, and I'm using the standalone Redream emulator. And this one, no pun intended, played like a dream. No matter what game I threw at it, at 1440p it played no problem. NBA 2K2 is usually my last-ditch Dreamcast game because this one will often stutter and have issues. But across the board, this one was super stable as well. So yes, Dreamcast is awesome on this device. Let's keep going. We're going to do Sony PSP next. We're also going to upscale this to 1080p, which is a 4x resolution on the original console. And like with the other systems, this one played awesome. Across the board, I would say that you can probably just set everything to a 4x resolution, and then every once in a while you'll find one that doesn't play perfectly and you'll have to bump it down to a 3x. Now these are the exact same specs that I use on the Odin Pro. Again, like I mentioned before, the performance difference between the two is kind of negligible. I actually had a hard time finding moments where the Odin Lite performed worse than the Odin Pro. And like I mentioned, some of those higher end games like God of War are going to require a 720p resolution instead of 1080p, but they still look and perform really well. Okay, let's keep going. Next we're going to do Nintendo GameCube. Now for this, I actually tested both the official as well as the MMJR performance version of this emulator. And I will say that yes, for the lower end GameCube games, things like Mario Kart Double Dash, you can do it with the Dolphin official. And surprisingly, this ran at full speed at a 3x or 1080p resolution as well. That is pretty darn amazing. Now it's not always going to be the case. For example, I tried out F-Zero GX on the official Dolphin, and even bumping it down to a 2x resolution, I was not getting full speed at all. I was not getting anywhere close to it. I should mention that all of this testing is done with the Vulkan backend as well. In fact, the only way that I could get F-Zero GX to play at full speed was to use the MMJR build with a 1x resolution, and then I also had to up the CPU clock speed internally to 300% in the emulator. But after that, it does play at full speed. Now, these are the same tricks that you have to do on the Odin Pro to get it running at full speed as well. So again, the performance difference is negligible. And so I think across the board, when it comes to my recommendation for Nintendo GameCube, it's going to be the exact same as it was in my starter guide. And that is, I recommend using the Dolphin MMJR emulator and then also use a 2x or 720p resolution. If you get a game that's not having great performance at that resolution, you've got a couple options. You can drop the resolution down to a 1.5 or a 1.0 if you'd like. And additionally, you could go into the settings and see if there are any hacks that would work as well. Metroid Prime is a good example. This one doesn't run very well at a 2x resolution and runs really well at a 1x. And so what I found is I ended up actually using a 1.5x resolution instead. This would have a little bit of slowdown here and there, but it did look a lot better than 1x, and so I decided this was a compromise worth using. At the end of the day, a lot of people ask me, what is the cheapest Nintendo GameCube handheld? And I think this one here is it. The Odin Lite, running at about $227 before shipping, is the cheapest device you can get that will give you consistently good GameCube gameplay. But that's not the only thing this device can do, so let's move over to PlayStation 2 next. For this one, I'm using the most recent build of Aether SX2, and again, I'm using the Vulkan backend. And for this, I used the same standard as I did for the Nintendo GameCube. I set it to a 2x or 720p resolution, and then I would just test it and see how the game played. If it didn't play very well, then I would adjust things like the resolution and then maybe some hacks as well. And I think I can comfortably say that across the board, you can probably do about 50% of the PlayStation 2 games at a 2x resolution, and they're going to play just fine. But once you start moving up to some of the harder to play games, something like Dragon Quest VIII, even at a 1x resolution, will have some slowdown here and there. And so once you get to that threshold, you kind of have to make a decision. Do you want to start using some hacks, or are you willing to live with those slowdowns? For something like Ratchet & Clank, you'll have to use a 1x resolution and then something like a mild underclock in order to get it to run at full speed. This will make your graphics a little bit muddy, and the gameplay will be kind of slow as well. But if you do want to play Ratchet & Clank on this device, it is possible. Now when you get up to those really high-end games, things like God of War 2, you're going to have to add even more underclocking in order to fix the performance issues. For example, here with a 1x resolution and a moderate underclock, God of War 2 is playable to me. Now the graphics are pretty darn muddy looking, and I'm not really sure this is an enjoyable experience, but if you really have a hankering for God of War 2 on this device, again, it's possible. Okay, I've got two more emulators to test out. We're going to do 3DS next. Now I will say 3DS was a mixed bag, and this was the first time where I saw a significant performance difference between this one and the Odin Pro. Now this doesn't really have to do with the performance of the chips themselves, but more has to do with optimizations and drivers with the actual chips. The Odin Pro is using a more popular Snapdragon processor, which means that most emulators are going to be more efficiently optimized. And so what that means in a real-world context between the Odin Pro and the Odin Lite is that you're going to have graphical glitches when playing 3DS on the Odin Lite. And it's totally random which games are going to work and which ones won't. For example, Samus Returns and Super Mario 3D Land, no problem whatsoever. But when you try another game, which is actually a lot easier of a game to run, like New Super Mario Bros. 2, there's a bunch of glitching and stuttering that happens as you're playing. Now some of it I think is related to shaders caching, but all the same, even after playing this for a long time, it was still doing the stuttering a lot. And so even though the games play at full speed with a 2x resolution, I did find this to be game-breaking for certain games. There's nothing more frustrating than doing well in something like Mario Kart 7 and then all of a sudden the screen hangs up and you lose your place in line. And so unfortunately for that reason, I cannot say that 3DS is playable on this device. You're going to have to deal with all these glitches. Now potentially these optimizations will improve over time, but I would not recommend buying this device for 3DS performance, even if it might be a little bit better sometime down the line. Okay, and the last emulator I want to test is Skyline. This is a Nintendo Switch emulator. I recently did a video about it. Now this ran really well on the Odin Pro, but unfortunately it doesn't run very well on the Odin Lite. Again, I think this has to do with optimizations particular to this chipset, because in general these Snapdragon phones just seem to do a lot better. Either way, I only tested a few games, but in my testing, the only game that played at full speed without a bunch of crashing was Sonic Mania. Every other game that I tested crashed at the menu screen. So maybe at some point down the line this will work better for Nintendo Switch emulation, but like with the Nintendo 3DS, I wouldn't hold your breath. Okay, I'm not a huge Android game fan, but all the same, I did test out a few of them. First thing I want to mention is there is a key adapter tool here if you swipe from the right. This will allow you to modify touchscreen controls to work with the buttons. And honestly, the performance of this little tool has improved significantly from when the Odin Pro first arrived. It was super easy to set up all of the buttons, and you're able to invert the axes on the analog sticks as well. I personally invert my Y-axis on the right analog stick, and so it was super awesome to be able to have this control scheme here on the device. Either way, I think when it comes to playing mobile games, you're going to have a great time here. I'm not sure what to test as far as benchmarking and things like that, but Grid Autosport is a kind of hefty game here, and as you can see, it's running great. Okay, now let's move over to streaming. We're going to start with Xbox Game Pass Cloud Streaming. And I tested a few games here, and all of them worked really well. Also bear in mind that because I live in Hawaii, the connection with Game Pass is not very good. So the fact that this works well in the first place says a lot about how good this is going to be as a streaming device. And so yes, not only is the connection nice and stable for people in areas like mine, but I'm happy to report that the analog triggers work perfectly with this as well. So for example, with Forza Horizon 5, I can use it with the gas pedal no problem. And the analog sticks and the button mapping, everything else worked great. So overall, if you're looking for something to play Xbox Game Pass, this is excellent. My only complaint here is going to be the analog sticks. I wish they stuck out a little bit more from the device itself. And like I mentioned earlier, I actually modded these on my Odin Pro and I made a video about it in my channel. Either way, yes, Xbox Game Pass streaming, super good. Let's move on to local streaming. We'll start with my PS5. Now for this, I'm testing with the PS Play app. This is a paid app. I think it costs something like $5, but it's well worth it. I've also gone into the settings here and changed the resolution up to 1080p. And as you can see, it's running smooth as butter with my PS5. Not only that, but some of the issues I had with the PS Play app on the Odin Pro have now been resolved. For example, this now registers an analog input with the triggers. If I press the right trigger down halfway, you can see it shoots kind of slowly, and then if I push it all the way, it'll shoot nice and fast. So yeah, this is going to be great for PS4 or PS5 streaming. Okay, now let's move over to streaming with the Moonlight app. Now this is my favorite app for PC streaming. It's very lightweight and it works super solid. And as you may suspect, I have a Moonlight streaming video and guide as well on my channel. Either way, as you can see here, I'm playing Hades at a 1080p resolution and it's running just fine via Moonlight. So you can most definitely stream your favorite PC games from your home network onto this device. And you can do more than just PC game streaming. You could also do some of those high-end emulators streamed to the device as well. For example, here's the Wii U emulator running Breath of the Wild, again at 1080p, and it looks and plays really well. When it comes down to it, your main limitation is going to be your PC itself. All the slowdowns that you're seeing here have to do with the shaders caching on my PC and not the connection. And so yeah, across the board, if you have a PC that's capable of running those high-end emulators, things like PS3 or Nintendo Switch, then absolutely go for it. You can stream onto the Odin Lite. In fact, I think this is one of the best use cases for the Odin Lite in particular. You have that Wi-Fi 6 connection to make it super stable, and like I mentioned, the controls are excellent, and the analog triggers and the buttons and everything else register correctly. Alright, we've been at this for a long time, and I'm trying really hard to not make this as long as my Odin Pro review, so let's actually get into the summary part. We'll talk about what I like and what I don't like about the Odin Lite. We'll start with what I like. Number one, this device feels super solid. It is one of the best feeling devices that I own. It makes something like the Nintendo Switch Lite feel like a child's toy by comparison. It's nice and chunky, it has those nice grips to them, and the plastic that they're using feels unbreakable. I also really appreciate the 6-inch screen on this device. I think it's an impressive size without being overly large. Now this one's very specific to the model that I bought, but I really like this white model here. Especially when you combine it with those LED lights, it looks amazing. I wish the light would do more colors than just blue, but even then, it still looks great. And as we saw extensively in this video, the performance on this is excellent. The Odin Lite is a bona fide GameCube and PS2 emulation machine. And on top of that, it can do way more than emulation. I think the streaming capability of this device is super impressive, and I kind of love the fact that you can use this as a phone if you really wanted to. This is one of the very few handheld devices that can actually be used completely wirelessly. And so if you want to have retro achievements on the go, this will be a great solution. And finally, when it comes to bang for your buck, there is no competition with the Odin Lite. With the current Indiegogo price of $227 before shipping, and then the projected price of $200 altogether from their website, this makes the other devices within that same price point look ridiculous. But of course, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Let's talk about some of the things I don't like about the Odin Lite. Number one is those buttons. The only way I can really describe them is being funky. And by that, I mean it requires a little bit more force than it needs to in order to press down. And when you do press down on them, it has a bit of a hollow, thunky sound as well. Personally, I would have loved it if these buttons were just a tiny bit smaller and a little bit shorter as well. I think they would glide a little bit better and it wouldn't require as much force to press down. I'm also not a fan of these analog sticks. I think they are too small and too short. And while I do think this screen is good, it's not quite as good as that old one was. As we saw in the video here, the amount of dynamic range between dimness and brightness is not as good as the V1 screens, and the battery life is significantly worse than on the Odin Pro, and I suspect that has to do with the screen more than the actual performance. And finally, by far, my biggest detractor here is the shipping chaos that surrounds AYN. If you put in an order today, you can't actually go to the website to do it, you have to go to the Indiegogo page. And on top of that, Lord knows when it's actually going to arrive on your doorstep. Even currently on their website, they are making promises that they've already not kept, and I suspect it's only going to get worse from here as they introduce new models here in the future. If I was king for a day, I would recommend that this company just stop with the whole Loki thing altogether and just focus on fulfilling the Odin right now. As it stands, they have a huge hit when it comes to the Odin models, and they can't even deliver these to their customers right now. The idea of putting down $200+ for something that will maybe arrive in about 4 to 5 months is kind of ridiculous. And in combination with that, if you order a Loki right now, who knows when that'll actually arrive either. At the end of the day, I would say due to this shipping chaos, this device is not for the faint-hearted. If you're looking for the best device around, yes, this is it. But just bear in mind that when you put your money down, you are taking a gamble as to when you'll actually be able to play the thing. And so, at the end of the day, I'm kind of torn about the AYN Odin Lite. Yes, this is easily my favorite dedicated Android handheld. But in terms of reliable shipping and fulfillment, this is one of my worst experiences I've had to date. And so really it's going to come down to you. Are you patient enough to wait for something like this? Or would you rather have something to play in the meantime and then kind of wait until this gets to a more retail situation? Either way, I think both decisions are totally viable, and it's really going to come down to what you prioritize the most. Either way, if you do order the AYN Odin Lite or the Odin Pro, I think you'll be super happy with it when it finally arrives. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Is this a device you've ordered, or are you waiting for it to be more available? As always, thank you for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.